person and reality. Person and reality. Interesting title, because F.H. Bradley's major work was called Appearance and Reality, and Whitehead's major work was Process and Reality. You see? So they're all trying to characterize reality, you see. Bradley in terms of appearances, which are, he maintains, only in some degree real. So you have degrees of reality in all appearance, rather than the phenomenal noumenal gap of Kant. And of course there are degrees of reality in all of the stages in the historical unfolding of Hegel's dialectic too, you see. But the title Appearance and Reality reflects that, like Whitehead's title Process and Reality, because God is in process like everything else is in process. And the underlying model that Whitehead uses is the model of sense perception, sense consciousness, which is a process. And so when Brightman does person and reality, he's saying that the concept of person is the concept you want for talking of what is most fully real and most ultimately real, and so obviously he's going to be talking of a personal God. And as a pluralist, that means there are God and other persons. And that's what made him attractive to Christian philosophers. He and Bertocci both, he did, over the problem of evil, take a theistic finitist position. That is to say, if you pose the problem of evil as the seeming contradiction in a set of 4 propositions, namely, God is altogether good, God is altogether powerful, God is altogether wise, and purposeless evil exists, then one of the 4 has to go, if there's a contradiction there. And Brightman felt that the God is altogether powerful had to go, and so God is of limited power. Now, I mention that because I think it's significant problem with metaphysical idealism to account for the problem of evil. If you have a monistic idealism, then obviously evil is part of the whole. If it's a pantheism, it's part of the divine, or else it's simply the shadow side of the good and is not really evil. And you remember how we ran into that problem with Plotinus, his theory of emanations, and his monistic idealism. Well, with a pluralistic idealism, you run into the problem of evil as well, you see. Because much of the traditional theistic approach to the problem of evil has to do with the existence of an ordered physical creation. An ordered physical creation which is ordered the way it is with purpose. So that when we run afoul of some of nature's ordered processes, we get stomach aches, holes in our teeth, clogged arteries, or maybe broken heads if we lean too far out of windows, you see. In other words, evil is due in part to the kind of discipline that's to our lack of restraint, lack of agreeing with the order of nature. But in any case, it serves, and this is the way it was developed, of course, a soul-making function in an ordered universe. You remember the soul-making theodicy. Now, if there is no physical order that exists outside of God's mind, or our minds, then there is no such external cause for evils. And in a Berkeleyan scheme, who causes your passive ideas of pain, you see. So the problem of evil really rolls back on God. well, Brightman, rather than wanting to make God blameworthy for evil and say he's not altogether good, and feeling he was a very passionate man, very much sensitive to the suffering of people, and seeing then that there's a lot of evil that seems to be quite purposeless, you see. He could not ascribe it to a disordered cosmos, the way Augustine did. He can only ascribe it to some given that's working in God's mind, over which God has no control. You see? What he calls surd evil. There is an irrational element, in other words, in reality. And so a finite God. Well, that's simply saying that the problem of evil is a perennial problem for the metaphysical idealist. Okay, so much for that run-through of the grocery list. And let me say then some things about Schopenhauer. You'll find that Stulp's chapter on Schopenhauer is very readable and very understandable. And the selections will, I think, give you the feeling that you have some meat on those bones. But by way of orientation to that, Schopenhauer's major work is entitled The World as Will and Idea. Now remember I said that idealists view things through the lens of what the self is. And two things that we're conscious of in ourselves, introspectively, are will and ideas. So if that is the lens, if that's what I see in the mirror, then I'm going to project that on reality as a whole. The world is will and idea. Now, it's not quite that easy, because he's influenced in emphasizing will by both Kant and Fichte, both of whom, as idealists, had maintained that our ideas of the material world, what Fichte called the non-ego, our ideas of the material world are simply phenomena. So what Schopenhauer does is to regard the world in terms of the ideas that we have as phenomena, and will as noumenal. Reality and appearance. The underlying reality is the nature of will. Now, how does he do that? Well, the phenomena is easy, now you know Kant so well. The phenomena part comes across very easily. The point is that the mind, the human mind, has ideas which are taken as representations of nature. But we order them with categories that are a priori. That is to say, like Kant, he thinks there are universal and necessary a priori categories. Categories that he speaks of as the fourfold root of sufficient reason. That is to say, he has four sets of categories. Four sets of categories. But they're not quite the same as Kant's categories. as far as their identification is concerned. What he has is the following: ground and consequent, cause and effect, space and time, motive and action. Now notice that those are categories in terms of which indeed we do talk of the world in which we live. They're not Newtonian categories like Kant's were. When we're talking, when he speaks of ground and consequent, he's talking of the logical ground for something and what follows. Premise and conclusion. Axiom and inference. He's talking here of the world of abstract ideas, the world of theoretical thought, which is the way it is. Kant said that too. Which is the way it is because of our categories. That's the world for me. It's the world as my idea. You see, the world that we think of that way. Similarly with cause and effect, which is the way we think in terms of physical objects, physical events. Causal necessity rather than logical necessity. Space and time, as Kant in his transcendental aesthetic made plain, have to do with mathematical objects. And so we find not only logical necessity, we find causal necessity, we find mathematical necessity in the way we think about the world. And when it comes to motive and action, this is how we think about the self. This is how we think about the self. And so we get the idea of moral necessity. So the world of our ideas is a world in which there is logical necessity, causal necessity, mathematical necessity, moral necessity. But all those necessities are just phenomena. That's the way it appears. It's not that way in reality. In fact, the antithesis, notice the word, the antithesis to necessity is what? Yeah. In reality, the world is will, not necessity. So that phenomena and noumena are antithetical. The world is of the nature of will. Well, how does he develop that? Well, he says, you see, that the world is my idea. That is to say, my Vorstellung, my representation. A symbolic way in which I talk about the world. The world is my idea.